The man stepped off the ferry as if the city belonged to him. Night air rolled in from the harbor, thick with diesel, salt, and grilled fish from the tavernas lining the quay. Athens, in the early 1960s, glowed with that particular restless light of a city rebuilding itself, neon pharmacy signs buzzing, trams clanging, radios leaking, chansons and bouzouki from open windows. At the customs shed, he handed over a worn passport with the name Yusuf Darwish, smiled politely at the Greek officer, and waited while the stamp came down with a dull thud. No one looking at him would have guessed that in other dossiers, in other languages, he was called Khalid Nasser, the man who moved weapons, money, and men across borders the way most people moved luggage. In alleys and refugee camps, his name was a rumor. In intelligence files, it was a red circle underlined twice. He adjusted his coat, hefted a modest leather bag, and walked out into the warm Athenian night. Across the street, a taxi driver flicked his cigarette and nodded, as if by chance. On a nearby bench, a young couple argued quietly in Greek. A British tourist fumbled with a map under a street lamp. Khalid saw none of it. He did not see that the taxi driver's route had been chosen days ago, that the couple's quarrel was nothing but a performance, or that the tourist's camera contained no film, only a carefully concealed microphone. He did not know that the switchboard girl at his small hotel had already been briefed on exactly what accent to use when she spoke to him, that the old shoeshine man outside the lobby had memorized his photograph, that a baker on the corner had been paid a month's wages to keep his shop open until dawn. He walked past a newsstand, past rows of newspapers, screaming about elections, labor strikes, and football matches, unaware that his arrival would never be mentioned in ink. By the time his shoes touched the cracked pavement of Piraeus, the city no longer belonged to him at all. For one night, for one man, Athens belonged to the people hunting him. Months earlier, in a windowless room in Tel Aviv, the city had been nothing more than a map pinned to a wall. It was late autumn in the year 1960, and the air inside the operations room smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. On the central table lay thin files stamped with foreign seals, photographs clipped from surveillance rolls, and a single grainy image of Khalid Nasser stepping out of a car in Cairo, chin tucked into his collar, eyes half hidden behind dark glasses. Around the table, men and one woman in plain shirt sleeves leaned in as the case officer spoke. He ran a fingertip down the map harbor, central station, embassies, police headquarters, the labyrinth of streets in Plaka, and said calmly that they would not catch Nasser in the shadows of his own territory, not in Damascus, not in Cairo, not in the refugee camps where boys carried rifles and men whispered his name with reverence. There, he was surrounded by layers of protection, bodyguards, secret police, party loyalists, and the anonymity of the crowd. In Athens, he would be alone, trusting in a false passport and the comfort of distance from the front lines. "We don't take him with a bullet from a rooftop," the case officer said. "We take him with a city." The idea sounded absurd the first time someone put it into words, turn an entire European capital into a trap for a single man. But as the hours passed, and the map filled with colored pins and small notes in Hebrew and English, the absurdity faded into method. They listed assets: a Greek shipowner who owed a favor from the days of gun running in the late 1940s, a hotel clerk who liked expensive perfume, a retired police officer who hated communists more than he feared scandal. They mapped telephone exchanges, tram lines, choke points where traffic always slowed at rush hour. They studied the rhythms of the city, the time bread ovens fired up at dawn, the hour priests started their vespers, when the bars emptied and the streets grew thin. Bit by bit, Athens ceased to be a distant dot on a map and became a living organism whose movements could be nudged, prodded, slowed. The woman at the table, Leah, traced a circle around the harbor and said quietly, "If we control what he sees, we control where he goes." The chief of station nodded. "We don't chase him," he replied. "We let the city carry him to us." By the spring of 1961, the city itself began to shift, though almost no one within it understood why. The first team arrived as tourists, carrying cameras and guidebooks, complaining loudly about the heat in broken French and German. They rented a modest flat overlooking a busy intersection, its balcony shaded by laundry flapping on clotheslines, and carefully cataloged the street below. Which buses were always late? Which corner shops stayed open past midnight? Where police patrols actually walked and where they merely claimed to? A second team followed, registering with the authorities as students enrolled in the university, attending a few lectures to keep up appearances while mapping sewer entrances, rooftop access points, and the position of every payphone within a half-kilometer of the harbor. A radio technician spent his evenings drinking ouzo with an electrician from the municipal works department, slowly buying his way toward control of certain traffic lights and repair schedules. A Swiss businessman began frequenting the same cafe as a mid-level telephone operator, learning how complaints were logged, how lines were redirected during outages, how long it took a technician to arrive when a switchboard failed. None of these small adjustments seemed connected to anyone watching from the outside. A construction site was announced on a narrow artery leading up from the harbor to Syntagma Square. A water main repair closed a different street late at night. The city council approved a minor change in tram routes to accommodate new tracks. For most Athenians, this was just the constant, annoying reshaping of an old city trying to modernize. For the people in the safe flat above the junction, it was architecture with a purpose. They knew that if a man stepped off a ferry and tried to hail a taxi, the first cab in line would be theirs. If he preferred to walk, a conveniently placed roadwork barrier would steer him away from certain alleys and into others. If he tried to use a payphone, there were 3 booths whose lines had been quietly wired to a listening post behind a shuttered bakery. A retired colonel in the Greek police, now employed as a security consultant, listened to their plan over strong coffee and concluded that it could never work. Cities were too chaotic, he argued. People were unpredictable. One small change in the weather, one protest march, one drunk sailor starting a fight could ruin everything. Leah smiled and replied that they were not trying to control the city absolutely. They only needed to control the choices one man would see at each moment. "We are not building a cage," she said. "We are building a maze where every path ends at the same place." In early summer of 1962, the cable came through. A source in Cairo reported that Khalid Nassar would travel to Athens under the name Yusuf Darwish, arriving on a specific ferry in mid-June. For weeks beforehand, the city's rhythm was tuned with the care of a watchmaker. The hotel in Piraeus, where he was expected to stay, had a sudden issue with its plumbing, forcing all new guests to be redirected to a nearby establishment where the night receptionist had long since been recruited. A random police inspection closed 2 bars near the harbor notorious for shady business, leaving the cafe opposite the correct taxi stand as the most attractive place for a traveler to sit and get his bearings. On the day of his arrival, the air was heavy, the sky smeared with the particular haze of a Mediterranean summer. Leah watched from a room above the docks, binoculars in hand, an ordinary book by her side in case anyone glanced up. She saw the ferry ease in, ropes thrown, gangplanks lowered, passengers spilled out, families burdened with luggage, sailors swaggering toward bars, priests in black robes, tourists clutching cameras. Then she saw him, thinner than in the photographs, but with the same wary tilt of the head, the same habit of scanning faces without seeming to. Her description went out over a small encrypted radio to teams scattered around the harbor and city center. The taxi they wanted him to take was third in line, driven by a quiet man in his 40s whose Greek was heavily accented in a way that suggested nothing more dangerous than years spent working on foreign ships. Ahead of him were 2 cabs they could not control, but fate and planning converged when a port official waved away the first to handle luggage and an impatient sailor jumped into the second. When Khalid reached the curb, there was only one choice left, and he took it without a thought. They did not tail him with speeding cars and screeching brakes. Instead, the car moved along a route already watched by people who appeared to be doing anything but watching the newspaper vendor arranging stacks of papers, the grandmother on her balcony watering plants, the priest crossing the street. At a certain junction, a traffic light that should have stayed green turned red, holding them for just long enough that a small truck pulled ahead to block the view of any potential follower behind. When the taxi turned onto a side street, a tram, accidentally slowed to a near stop, allowing Leah to walk parallel down a different lane and catch a brief glimpse of Khalid's face through the back window. He checked in at the hotel, gave his false name, and requested a wake-up call for the next morning. In his mind, the city was merely a backdrop, a temporary stage set. In theirs, it was already closing around him. The operation to take him was scheduled for the following night, timed to the hour when the city sagged between late revelry and early duty. By then, the web extended from his hotel room to the alleys he might choose if he felt nervous. A surveillance team in the building opposite had listened as he spoke briefly on the telephone to a contact, arranging a meeting at a café near Ammonia Square. Through the crackle of the line, the radio technician marked the time and quietly altered the circuits so that if Khalid tried to make another call later, the connection would fail, forcing him back toward the payphones they controlled. They did not intend to grab him at the café itself. Too many variables, too many eyes. Instead, they let him sit there for an hour, nursing a coffee, watching the door, while the city shifted in small ways outside his awareness. A protest march that should have passed down one street was rerouted by a police order to another, clearing a route for a car they would later need. A municipal crew, warned of a fictitious gas leak, dug up a section of road that blocked the most direct path to the train station. In a small office behind the café, Leah traced his possible exits with a pencil on a street plan and saw that every path now bent toward a particular corner where a certain lamppost had been malfunctioning for days. When he finally left, frustrated by his contact's absence, he felt the first tug of unease. The telephone at the café crackled uselessly when he tried to call the number again. A passing patrol car lingered a little too long at the intersection, so he turned down a side street instead. The lights on that street seemed dimmer than they should have been. Somewhere above him, a transistor radio played a love song. Somewhere behind, footsteps matched his for half a block and then melted away. He decided to walk toward a main avenue to find a taxi and regroup. As he approached the corner with the broken lamppost, the entire block went dark. The failure had been engineered at the power substation 2 hours earlier, masked as routine maintenance gone wrong. In the sudden blackness, his instincts screamed. He reached inside his coat, fingers brushing metal, and spun back the way he had come only to find a car blocking the narrow street, doors opening in silence. A voice, in heavily accented Greek, called out something about police checks and identification. He considered running, but another figure appeared at the mouth of the alley behind him, casting a long shadow in the faint glow from a distant billboard. In those moments, the city that had always felt safely anonymous now pressed in on him from every side. The shutters, the balconies, the parked vehicles, even the silent tram at the next junction seemed complicit. When they moved on him, it was swift and practiced. A flash of light in his eyes to blind him, a hard grip on his arm, a needle he never quite saw. To neighbors looking from behind curtains, if they bothered to look at all, it was just another nighttime police arrest in a city where such things happened. They could not see that the uniforms were slightly wrong, that the car's license plates belonged to a vehicle impounded months earlier, that the officers spoke Greek like men who had learned it from tapes rather than childhood. In less than 30 seconds, Khalid Nasser was no longer in Athens. He was in the custody of people who did not exist. By dawn, the city had returned to itself. The temporary power outage was logged in a municipal ledger as the result of equipment fatigue, marked for repair. The roadworks that had blocked a crucial shortcut were cleared away by a yawning crew complaining about overtime. The police column that had been diverted from its usual route trudged back to familiar patrols, its officers none the wiser about why their orders had changed for a single night. In a safe flat on the outskirts, the air still smelled of chloroform and sweat. Khalid lay on a mattress, wrists secured, eyes fluttering as the drug wore off. Leah sat in a chair by the window, watching the first light bleed over the hills. On the table beside her lay the tools of their borrowed city. Fake badges, radio sets, street plans, folded and refolded until the creases resembled battle scars. Outside, a bread truck rattled past, the driver whistling, unaware that one of his early deliveries would be not loaves, but a human cargo transferred into a false bottom compartment for the journey to the port. There, another ship would await, papers in order, manifests properly stamped. The man who boarded it would be logged under a different name again, one that even he did not yet know. In Tel Aviv, the operations room buzzed as confirmation came through in fragments. Secure, en route, no casualties, local authorities, unsuspecting. On the wall, the map of Athens was already being stripped of its pins. Streets that had, for one night, been instruments in an invisible orchestra were now just streets again, clogged with traffic, alive with gossip, indifferent to the fact that a secret war had briefly reshaped their currents. Leah knew that reports would be written, successes quietly celebrated, lessons distilled. Analysts would marvel at how, without firing a shot in public or staging a dramatic chase, they had plucked one of the most elusive men in the region from a foreign capital. Yet, as she watched the city wake up, she also understood the cost of what they had done. To trap one man, they had nudged the lives of thousands, a taxi driver called away from home, a waitress sent on an unexpected break, a priest delayed on his walk back to the church. None of those people would ever know why their day had felt slightly off, why a light had failed, why traffic had snarled here instead of there. They would never know that. For a few choreographed hours in the early 1960s, their city had not entirely been theirs. It had been a weapon, sharpened and aimed at a single target. Years later, when the story would be told in whispers within certain rooms, it would be reduced to a sentence. In those days, when they wanted a man badly enough, Mossad did not just send an assassin. They borrowed an entire city, turned its veins and bones into a maze, and closed it around him until there was nowhere left to run.